Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast about world affairs and the people who shape it. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch, and in this show we discuss topical global issues and have in-depth conversations with personalities in foreign policy. Global Dispatches is presented in partnership with Humanity in Action, an international educational organization, and I am a Humanity in Action Senior Fellow. If California were a country, it would be the sixth largest economy in the world, on par with France. Its population is greater than that of countries like Poland and Canada, so what happens in California can very much impact the rest of the world. One fairly direct manifestation of California's global relevance is in the state's approach to climate change. Earlier this summer, California revamped its cap-and-trade program. This is a policy innovation intended to curb emissions by creating a market around greenhouse gases like carbon. Basically, companies can buy and sell permits to each other to release set amounts of greenhouse gases. So that's one way California is having a global impact. There are others as well. And on the line with me to discuss California's global impact is California State Senator Ben Allen. Senator Allen represents about 1 million people in communities around Los Angeles and has been in the state Senate since 2014. We discuss California's approach to climate change and also some strategies that Senator Allen and his colleagues are employing to blunt some of the effects of the federal government's decision to pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement. We also discuss some other issues of transnational concern, like ensuring the education of immigrant children is not interrupted should they get deported. This is a fascinating conversation about how individual states can impact international relations, and I was glad to catch up with Senator Ben Allen. He, like me, is a Humanity in Action Senior Fellow, and we do discuss a bit about how that program helps guide his work to this day. All right, now here is my conversation with State Senator Ben Allen.
The interesting thing, of course, is that California took on was playing a very important global leadership role on climate change before even Trump became president. Mm-hmm. You know, California had a seat at the table at the Paris Accords, right next to Canada, in a lot of the meetings.
Well, I was looking at at sort of the size of California's economy versus other countries. It's basically the size of France. It has a similar and equivalent GDP.
Yeah. Exactly. It's extraordinary. I mean, we on our own, we're the sixth largest economy in the world. We're apparently on track to overtake the UK, partly because of partly, of course, because of the Brexit. Mm-hmm. But it's a pretty amazing thing. There's a lot of power in the state of California, both politically, economically, et cetera.
So
innovatively.
How can sort of the state government, the state legislature, even individual state legislators like yourself, wield influence globally from, a seat in Sacramento?
So when we have this kind of economic and political power, and then when we have the kind of consensus that exists within the state, the fact that we've got pretty unified government on the Democratic side, for example, where people actually care about environmental protection, and we were able to pass laws that actually end up having global impact. And by the way, the recent cap and trade deal that we just struck, that we hope will provide a continuing model for other jurisdictions around the world, was actually the product of a bipartisan compromise that involved the very close collaboration with former Republican Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, and of course the former Republican leader of the Assembly, Chad Mayes. He was the Republican leader at the time, and he played a big role in helping to strike a deal with the governor to come to terms in a more market business friendly way, such that it actually ended up that the Chamber of Commerce supported our cap and trade deal because they saw this as a market friendly way of addressing the state's climate change goals and needs. But the thing is, so when we have an economy of our size and we pass policies that help to promote, incentivize, and require changes in the environmental space, it forces businesses and industries to change. One perfect example is in the area of emissions from vehicles. California was given a waiver. California was allowed under the Clean Air Act to set stricter standards than the federal government on automobile emissions. Part of that was a recognition of the fact that California had these terrible air conditions. People were very concerned about health impacts and environmental impacts of the smog crisis in Los Angeles during the 70s.
Yeah, there's like
and
the famous
result,
photos of LA in the 70s, like all covered in smog.
Exactly. So exactly. And as a way of trying to address that enormous challenge, California went off on its own and was able to adopt a whole set of environmental policies that were much more aggressive than what other states were pursuing. And ultimately, they were able to force the entire automobile industry to make structural changes to cars, which ended up impacting the whole country and, in fact, the whole world. By forcing a reduction of emissions, California has so many of the nation's cars. We were able to force technological changes that ended up having a follow-on impact globally. We're a major petroleum user. As much as we'd like to reduce our use of petroleum, the fact is that we end up a major consumer of petroleum as a state. And so when we pass policies and procedures that force higher energy or higher energy efficiency, those kinds of laws can end up forcing changes in technology, which can be scaled around the world. So, and we're able to do that because we're so big. I think it would be much harder for a significantly smaller state to do that.
There's often that cliche that, states are the laboratories of democracy, but I've seen, commentary about how California's cap and trade bill, which I know, you had a hand in helping get sort of passed and revamped this time around, as you just alluded to, is something that is being sort of considered like a policy innovation that other constituencies, other districts around the world are looking to. Can you, I guess, talk a little bit, one, about people who are not familiar with what the cap and trade system is, what it is, the law that you passed this summer, and how, or what you're hearing from, other people from around the world about sort of the innovations embedded in this piece of legislation, how it might be copied in other jurisdictions.
So cap and trade is a market-based policy solution that seeks to set ever declining caps on our greenhouse gas relation emissions, our carbon emissions, and a trading system whereby businesses can buy allowances to continue to emit carbon and continue to emit other greenhouse gas related pollutants. So the business knows that there is an ever declining amount of emissions that will be allowed, and they can make a decision as to whether to immediately cut the emissions themselves or have to pay some money to allow themselves to continue to emit, with a mind toward the fact that ultimately those emissions are going to continue to be reduced, and so the costs associated with those allowances will continue to rise. So it's a way of mandating statewide emissions reductions in a more market-friendly way. And the idea is that this is a way of bringing a system, an economic system, toward carbon emissions and other greenhouse gas emissions in a more in a less economically shocking way than if we were to just tell emitters, tell factories, et cetera, that they have to cut their emissions tomorrow. A lot of factories aren't ready to do that. And so what the cap and trade system does is it allows them to make the financial decision: how much am I going to cut back today? How much I can buy allowances, which will allow me to continue to innovate and hopefully get to a place where they'll be able to stay in business in the future at a much reduced emission system. So it's a policy and economic structure that has proven to be successful so far. You put the money from the auction into programs that seek to mitigate or support efforts to reduce emissions as a state. So, for example, we now have all this money that we get as part of the auction for these allowances, for these emissions allowances, and we can then put that money toward good things like helping our freight truck fleet shift over to greener technology. helping to fund technological innovations in tailpipe emissions, helping to pay for more transit, more green ways of helping people get around and build cities. So it's both. It melds market needs and environmental needs in an imperfect, but I think ultimately relatively elegant way.
And the law you passed this summer is like an iteration of cap and trade that it seems like a lot of other municipalities, other governments from around the world are looking to.
Yes, and we can, and there are opportunities for cooperation where we can trade, where we can enter into markets together. We can sell allowances and together and scale up the system if we want to as well. But I know that the Chinese are very interested. I mean, our governor has been spending quite a bit of time in Beijing talking directly. I mean, he had an hour-long meeting during his last trip with Xi Jinping, talking about this problem. I think people are looking to California because they're having such a hard time working with the Trump administration on environmental and other issues. They're saying to themselves, well, if we can't necessarily work collaboratively well with Washington on certain things, well, at the very least we can work with California, and we're going to get a big chunk of the American economy when we work directly with California.
Well, that kind of raises an interesting question to me, which is the extent to which like the politics around these kinds of sustainability questions that California has long been a leader on have shifted in the 10 months since the Trump administration took office. I mean, has there, like, you said, like, the cap and trade system existed, pre-existed the Trump administration, but has, like, the politics around some of these issues changed in any meaningful way?
I think that the new Trump administration has certainly increased the urgency, the sense of urgency in a place like California. I think before we loved our leadership role, but we also had a partner in President Obama and allowed and sort of expected and worked with his administration to play a role in the broader American leadership role on these issues. Now we can't count on that sort of partnership, and in fact, we're seeing a stepping back of the American leadership role, and we're feeling the need to step up and take on that role as much as we can under our constitutional structure. I mean, there are limitations to what we can do as a state, but there are also a lot of things that we can do. And I think most folks in the political leadership of California are pretty horrified by so much of what's happening in Washington. And we see it as our responsibility to try to step up and fill in the gaps as best we can.
It's interesting. I was at this sustainability conference last year it was actually in the Middle East, but Mayor Kasim Reed of Atlanta was speaking, and he made a point that I found fascinating, which is that he could sell some of these sustainability projects as being part of like the hashtag resistance, and it sort of increases their political viability if they're seen as sort of being done in opposition to Trump's in support of like the Paris Agreement.
Yeah, and that's true. That's true from both when it comes to how the policy may play overseas, and also how it may play with the core constituencies in a state like ours, or certain cities around the country. I will say the danger, of course, always is that we figure out a way to make sure that there's not that we don't harm the cause by. It's a tricky balance, right? You on the one hand, it's so hard to play ball with Donald Trump, given his thin skin, given his reactionariness, his punitiveness. But at the same time, you've got to also make sure that you recognize that he's the president of the United States, has a lot of tools at his disposal. And you want to make sure that you're not picking too much of a fight unnecessarily. I mean, there are some folks in California who just relish sticking it to the president at every opportunity. And I think ultimately our goals have to be about advancing a strong progressive agenda rather than fighting the president. Fighting the president is may feel good, but ultimately the goal is the agenda. It's not picking a fight with the president. And I think that's something a lot of folks have to keep in mind.
Can I say, it seems, aside from climate change, one of the key areas in which sort of local governments and state governments might have an impact, though perhaps indirectly, is on immigration. Obviously, the states don't control immigration, the federal government does, but the states are where immigrants live. And I'm wondering sort of what you're doing, what some of your colleagues are doing to, to perhaps like protect vulnerable migrants, whether they be here legally or undocumented.
Well, there's a lot of work happening in this area right now in the state of California. Folks are first of all, a lot of what we're doing is providing defense and supports for immigrant families, both on the legal side, emotional support for the kids. We've even started working a little bit with Mexico on cross-curricular needs because of all these kids who are getting deported who have never set foot in Mexican schools and have spent their entire careers in American schools and California schools. And how do we work closely with Mexican schools to help these kids who are fish out of water all of a sudden?
Wait, can you explain that? Because that's not something I was aware of. I'm sure a lot of my listeners aren't. So you have kids who are not here legally who are being deported?
Yeah, they get deported. They get sent to Mexico or elsewhere. I mean, Mexico, of course, is the largest sending country. And all of a sudden, they are now in Mexican schools for the first time in their lives. And the Mexican schools don't really know what to do with them. And so how do we coordinate efforts so that at the very least the Mexican schools can have access to some of the curriculum, some of the materials that they've been using in the California schools, and use that as a way of trying to help them transition into the Mexican school system. So that's been one of many things that we've been doing. One of the most prominent things we've been doing, of course, is looking at this whole question of sanctuary city, sanctuary state. I think that the debate has gotten a little heated, but fundamentally what it's about is saying that local law enforcement ought to focus on fighting local crime, that the goal of law enforcement, both at the local and the state level, ought not to be to carry out, Donald Trump's, anti-immigrant agenda, but that their focus really needs to be on fighting local crime. And that's their task. That's their number one responsibility. And that if we're going to make sure that that's where local government's focus is. Now, the question becomes, how much do you mandate local law enforcement's ability to work with the feds when it comes to deporting undocumented immigrants who may have been involved in crimes? And after a very long and drawn-out negotiation that involved the police chiefs and the sheriffs and the governor's office and the Senate President pro tem, we were able to finally come to an agreement where we were able to, I think, strike a pretty fair balance where we were going to, limit the ability of law enforcement to work with the feds in certain cases, but not but certainly not jam up law enforcement's ability to do its job and make sure that those really violent felons who are out there are not those kinds of folks will be the local law enforcement could hand over to the feds if they so choose, but that other folks who are caught up in the system will not be used as pawns in the battle right now with the Trump administration. Well, let me just mention a couple of interesting things that I've been working on. That let me mention one bill that I think actually your listeners might be pretty interested in. We've been working hard to try to make sure that we protect as much as we can in the wake of some of the more outlandish commitments and promises being made by the Republicans in Washington. One of the things I think deeply concerns us is the threaten massive sell-off or leasing of federal land to exploiters of all different forms. And part of my job as a legislator is, and as a lawyer, I suppose, is to come up with clever solutions to this current constitutional crisis. And one of the things we were able to come up with was a bill, SB 50. It's my bill that was just signed by the governor, in fact, that makes it so that if the federal government wants to sell off federal land within the state of California, we set up a process by which the state is given the right of first refusal for the land. And then if that process is not followed, we would prevent our registrar recorders from recording the deed of sale.
That sets up a constitutional
it does, but
dilemma,
the interesting
it seems.
thing is, well, there's absolutely. So there's no question that the federal government, there are limitations to what we can do vis-a-vis the federal government's right to do as it wants with its own land. But one of the things that we found is it's very clear that the act of recording is very much in the hands of the locals under the constitutional structure, and a number of court decisions have upheld that idea. And so, that's an area where we do have some control. And ultimately, all we're doing is give. Yeah.
Well, it seems like it's. Yeah. Go ahead.
All we're doing is giving the people of the state the right to determine if they want to be able to have that land first. And it doesn't seize the land. We would have to come up with a market viable amount of money to pay for it, et cetera. But it's about using constitutional tools at our disposal to mitigate against the worst dangers, the most problematic implications, ramifications of these terrible policies and promises that are being made by the folks in Washington right now. And that was my bill. It was signed into law, and we're certainly hopeful that other states may look at it as a tool to protect themselves against these more radical proclivities of the feds right now.
And if nothing else, it could at least slow down their land grabbing.
Exactly. At the very least, it slowed down. Hopefully, we'll be able to restore some accountability or at least some balance to the force in Washington next year with the elections. Who knows what'll happen? But it's funny. I mean, I've never been such a big fan of states' rights before, but I've signed me in.
A good progressive like you, Senator. Yeah.
Yeah, I know it's weird. It's a weird place to be, but this is our responsibility. There's a reason why we've got different levels of government. We're looking out for our folks right now, our values, our beliefs when we pass things like this.
So let me ask you one last question. So you mentioned that you just came back from the Humanity in Action conference, where you spoke about the ability of states to put up a resistance to the excesses of the Trump administration, among other things. I mean, have you ever thought about how your experience in Humanity in Action has informed or shaped your work to this day?
Well, it's a wonderful experience and a incredible network. It's so neat to see Humanity Action Fellows, moving out of the academy and both student and graduate student positions to now take on leadership roles, both within the academy and business and the private sector, but also in nonprofits and in government. And the fact that we've got one of our fellows I hear every once in a while on the BBC when I'm driving around LA, helping to drive policy for the European Union, serving the European Parliament. It's immensely exciting to be part of this network that of folks who are smart, but most importantly, deeply committed to making the world a better place and a globalist international perspective that involves real respect for other cultures and countries. Rather than a relationship of exploitation. I had a magical summer with Humanity in Action and have participated in a number of really meaningful programs with them ever since. It helped to ground who I am, helped me think about my values and helped to frame the way I look at the United States from within a different context. It's so important sometimes to get out of your own country, your own world, to see how to just gain a new perspective on things that you take for granted. Sometimes spending some time outside of the United States, working with folks in places like Europe, where they have some real similarities to our system, but some real differences too, and to see how they grapple with the social challenges and policy challenges and economic challenges that they have is so valuable, so meaningful. And to have had this formative experience with Humanity in Action, with the really bright, sharp fellows from the program, it really did help to frame who I wanted to become. I think it got me. It certainly strengthened my commitment to spending a career in public service. It very much strengthened my commitment to an approach to public service that involves being really open to other models and other ideas and other countries and other types of people. So I'm always interested not only in what other states do when it comes to a policy conundrum, but what do some of our partner countries in Europe do, about incarceration or about education policy or transportation or, urban planning. I mean, Humanity Action helped to always remind me that that's an important question to ask too. And unfortunately, so many policymakers have a hard time even looking at other states, let alone other countries, when it comes to the decisions that they make. And Humanity Action really, I think, situated me at least to want to be part of a much broader conversation about these big policy conundrums that we face.
Well, Ben, thank you so much for your work. Your work in California, as you said, affects us all. So thanks for fighting the good fight. We appreciate it. Thank you, Ben.
Okay. Thank you, Mark. Really appreciate it, man.
All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to Ben for speaking with me. It's always good to see people that you knew way back when become themselves leaders in global affairs and in state affairs. And it was a great conversation. Glad to catch up with Ben. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
The views and opinions expressed in the podcast are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the policies or positions of Humanity in Action.